Alright, doing kind of a draft science style video anyway. We'll map the consciousness. So yeah, instead of a reality map, we'll have a consciousness map. A brain map. Call it that, maybe brain map. Yeah, we'll call it that. Anyway, regarding Modern Mystic comment. Alright. He's been leaving these little snarky comments. I don't know what this infinity sign exclamation point. I don't know what that's an emoticon for. But he's, all of his remarks end with that kind of thing. I don't know, what is that thing? It just seems like it's kind of a rude way to end sentences, statements. Anyway, it's kind of yobbish, I think, to be using that all the time. Anyway, with consciousness being declared the watcher, I think you are going to run into trouble with consciousness being in good or bad states. Yeah, I don't see how that's any problem whatsoever. I mean, where we put the feely bag in the brain doesn't really matter. I mean, feely bag gets pressed, and that's just the way it is. I mean, we know it's in consciousness. We know consciousness is aware of feelings. The argument is whether or not they're a byproduct or whether they're a product. And I'm saying, yeah, of course they're a byproduct. So they're like any other reflex. So I guess that's where we're going to start with this. So anyway, I don't think you can get away with it being the watcher and the feeler. Seems to me that watching and feeling are very similar kind of things. I mean, yeah, it's like I sense the environment. I just had this heat lamp on just because I was going to try that as a light source. And yeah, I could feel it. Okay, I couldn't consciously control it. I couldn't do it. I could consciously feel it, but I wasn't making anything. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not. It's yeah. You feel it. It's watching. It's sensing, and it's not doing anything. Best do some thinking. I don't think I need to do no thinking. I think I got to do some explaining maybe, but I don't have to do any thinking. It seems all kind of obvious to me. So anyway, let's just start with, alright, so the concept of, schematic, okay? We do a schematic kind of thing. Okay, so I haven't done this ahead of time, so I'm just going to go through this, and these maps will get better as we go along. Alright, but let's understand what function is, right? I mean, function is you get this organ, this sense thing, right? And like, let's say an eyeball, whatever the symbol could be. So you could even have an eyeball as the symbol, okay, of a sense organ. And information comes in from the sense, and then there can be all kinds of different reflexes. And so let's just do a little squiggly for reflexes, right? That's the schematic sign for resistance, but we'll cheat. We'll use it as yes, something happens. Okay, so that's a reflex, right? Alright, so the first reflex can be, close the eye because there's a threat. So the reflex goes to an action of some kind. Alright, now those actions are going to be all kinds of different things, right? So the action could be, protection. The action could be some other processing. But let's just understand that the sense data comes in, the information comes in, and there's a reaction from a reflex. And the actions themselves, right, more complex actions would also be reflexes, right? They're going to be a kind of a knee-jerk. So the first knee-jerk could be a knee-jerk, right? Your knee actually jerks. The second reaction could be more complex, more delayed, more thought processing, more knee-jerks inside your brain. And the action could be, let's say, a thought, or it could be a feeling. Now, those are going to be complex things, so we're going to have to show how those fit in. We can't just say thought, feeling, and just say that's what the reflex does. It creates that automatically. Obviously, there's a mechanism to how thoughts and feelings are created, and I think the mechanism is going to be what we're going to call feedback. So this feedback thing comes in through here, right? So your brain creates something, and the something it creates is almost a new sense, and it's going to be fed back into the senses. So you're going to have some reflexes are going to create mechanisms that are just going to end up being fed back in as a something, a thought, a feeling, which is just another knee jerk, but it's an internal knee jerk inside your brain. And that knee jerk is going to come in through this, this whatever we're going to call this mechanism where the feedback comes in, and that's what I'm going to call the consciousness, right? So your consciousness is just this mechanism through which the data comes in. And in a sense, what I'm going to be arguing eventually, boy, this drawing's already in big trouble, is that this consciousness thing, this feedback mechanism, ends up just being another sense. It just ends up being another thing that creates this input coming in. So it's just another input device. Another one of these things to go through these patterns of reflexive reaction. Alright, so now we got that figured out. So we have senses. So you could say, okay, let's just put the senses here, right? Let's just put 5 senses. And they come in, and what we know happens to them is that one of the reactions that take place on these senses, right, your 5 senses, is they can be focused, right? So we know that there's some kind of mechanism in your brain down here somewhere in the downstream part that does this focusing part. All right, that sits there and basically, dilates your pupils, or makes your skin get goosebumpy, or heightens your sense of smell or your sense of taste, whatever, and it is changed because of this mechanism of focus. Alright, so then we know the other common reaction to all these things. Let's make these lines just a little bit longer. Okay, is they all have these really, the true knee-jerk reflex. So they all have some sort of heightened awareness thing. Okay, and so that's all right here. These are all those quick reflexes, and that those quick reflexes seem to be sort of tied. We'll just use a dotted line to this focusing mechanism, but that they also just create an output. Alright, so this is what we'll call an output to the environment. So this will be like action. Okay. Now the trick is the actions too have their own little learned thing. So you have learned reactions. So we're going to have to come back to that because these are programmed too. Alright, but let's just say these things are basically just static. These are the things nature gives you, these crude reflexes. Now you get into the real brain part. Okay, so we're still in subconscious. These are all subconscious reactions. And so let's see how to draw what gets into the plane of consciousness. Yeah, it's just hard to draw, right? Because you're trying to say which one comes first. Which one? How do you visualize the input devices? And then this idea of your consciousness sitting there spectating this, because it's getting these squiggly stuff is happening, and it's going into your consciousness. So anyway, we know that the two things that we're really concerned about. So here's the physical action. So let's just say that just happens. It's programmed. Let's just not waste time on that. And so let's get to these two things, which are the important things, these reactions of thinking and feeling. So we know the senses come in, and they've got to be, they're blended, right? They're all coming to one thing. They don't just independently function anymore. Now they go into this one processor. And we'll just call that brain, right? This one little box, the CPU. And let's not deal with what's in it now, but let's just figure out what comes out of it. And so this is just like one big giant reflex, right? I mean, there's all kinds of knee jerks going on inside that CPU, and it creates responses to this combined sense data. So it sees two things like red, ball, whatever, John, dog, book. And so it combines those things that it sees, and it processes them into a memory, or it triggers some other thing, But anyway, the point is it creates an action. So one of the actions it can create is it can just say, do something physically. Okay, so it can create that physical stuff into the environment, an output. Okay, output action. A physical output of your muscles moving and you doing something. Now the other thing it can create is this idea of a thought. Okay, so a memory. Let's see, what else could we call those things? I think a memory is a good way to understand what a thought is. A thought is, your brain is almost, it's remembering concepts as if they were events. And so they flow back into you when your brain is triggered. There's a knee-jerk in here that flows back and says, I know that category. So this is where the categories become important. And where your ability to recognize patterns. So this is, again, this pattern recognition takes place, is inside, that's what it creates. In terms of this thing here now, your memory is like a sense, right? So now it becomes one of these input devices. Alright, so your brain creates this as a reflexive reaction. It reconstructs an image and sensations and all kinds of stuff. It reconstructs what this had as inputs. So it kind of takes an old input stream, reconfigures it, adds a little category information, a little nuance, combines 2 or 3 memories together even, and that becomes a new sense. So this is like your 6th sense of thought, of memory. So we'll just call it, maybe memory is the way to make it easiest to remember. But now it's a new sense. Okay, so this, if I could highlight this with red or something, yeah, these senses. So you have sense 1, it could be your eyes, sense 2, sense 3, sense 4, sense 5. Well, here we go. We got sense number 6 here, and we'll call that your constructed memories. Now you could, in my opinion, combine feelings and memories and just make it one, but I think for the purpose of understanding, maybe it'd be better to separate thought style sense data from feeling style sense data. Alright, so we know that this stuff here, this is now in the range of consciousness, right? This stuff pops into the thing we call consciousness. And so this is like this is the place where awareness is. So let's just make that a circle or something. And I don't know if I'm going to have room to fit everything that has to go in there. But this is your conscious awareness. And so that's where it throws this memory stuff. And so somehow obviously these streams are also in consciousness. So we have to have some sort of idea of this sense data that has been focused will end up in this conscious stream. It flows through it in this direction, and then we won't even say what it does when there's feedback, but obviously everything this thing produces is now getting fed back. So because we've made this a new input device, we have a feedback loop. So the stuff comes in here, it gets processed with a reaction that creates memories and visual images inside your consciousness. So it's almost like a transparency now has been placed on top of this stream of data that's coming in. So now this data from these senses has this overlay of thoughts and memories, and then it goes into this stream of sense consciousness, this 6th sense that's going into the brain. So not only can your brain subconsciously react to these sense data, but it does go through this consciousness stream also as feedback. So your senses see your actions in the world. Your actions in the world end up getting fed back in through the crude senses. Alright, so you act, my hand moves, I see my hand move, so that gets fed back in. And now we have this other stream of feedback that goes through the consciousness here of the raw sense data coming in before it's even processed. But then the output, see here, this line here is not very thick, but this is the important one, right? I mean, the brain creates this output. So like this action can be an output, the other output is it creates this memory, this illusion inside your head of more data, of more information. Alright, so anyway, so that's so we just put a separation there, and then, so those are thoughts, and the other thing it's creating is this feeling thing. Alright, now that one's really much more difficult to describe as what it exactly is. I would argue that the brain is basically, so when it creates this let's see how to explain. So this is input. Thoughts are input. Feelings are quite obviously seem to be one of the output devices. So I can't have input devices look the same as output. So this was a mistake here. This has to go like that. That's an output arrow. So we'll make that a dark triangle. Okay, so that's output. And we could argue that, see, there's the dark arrow for the output of the thoughts. And so the other output is this feeling thing. So what I'm going to argue is the feeling thing is actually created. So even though it's just this little arrow, it's probably actually created by this focusing mechanism. So it's probably the brain perverts these five senses in ways to create the illusion of this feeling. But let's just, for the sake of the video, you just acknowledge the existence of this idea of feeling, in the sense that they are, some of them are like we'll call them, not the raw sense data, because that's kind of reflexive in terms of feeling. So there's some that are really crude, like hot, cold. But we're really talking about the more complex, like emotions and stuff. The stuff that has the positive and the negative aspect to it, component. And so that positive and negative component gets fed back in. It just bleeds right through your consciousness. So it was produced here, and it just, like thoughts are produced in memories, and it just feeds right back into this sixth sense, into the CPU, and that's what can create this learning stuff. So that's how your brain rewards or punishes success and failures, is by this capacity to create this positive and negative. This is like a key component, because now it can enhance your output action. So if you're trying to throw a strike in baseball, your brain can say, okay, this is basically how you do it. You move your arm this way and throw ball. And then as it's doing it, it will say good or bad. It'll assess your function. It'll go through the processor. The processor will say that was close or that was not close. You're getting hot or you're getting cold. And it'll impose positive and negative sensations as you start doing better or worse. And so that feedback, that information will be used to make the output muscle memory get more and more functional in terms of throwing strikes. And so this reflex, this knee-jerk of action, will get more and more refined and more capable, and it will become its own little piece of software. And so eventually all the CPU will have to say is, do the throw strike program, throw curveball, throw something else, and these will just be preset, well manufactured mechanisms. So when I say words, my words have been practiced. So my brain has practiced doing it, and that's why it's proficient at doing it. And so each kind of program, it just triggers one of these reflexes. And that's really all this thing is a bunch of knee jerks that are getting more and more refined. So they get more and more precise and not having any, there's no waste in that little squiggle, is as you become more and more practiced in your life and in your how you think and how you feel. Your brain keeps monitoring all that's going on, and it's monitoring your overall efficiency by using this capacity to create this feel good, feel bad thing. And so this feeds back into your consciousness. On every move you have that feedback. Again, feedback is that's the incredibly important concept here. I would argue that consciousness is an illusion inside your brain created by this mechanism right here of feedback, creating essentially this illusionary sixth sense, this internal perception sense. And that's the, that's the basics. So okay, this doesn't look great, but I think it accounts for what needs to be accounted as mechanisms. What's going to be the tricky part is, okay, this thought thing I think is a little easier to explain because thoughts have a real symbolic nature. So I think they can be tied to just memories of what your eyes saw and what your ears heard and what your skin felt and all that stuff. So it's just making a clear little memory out of previous circumstances, and that's what a category just becomes, a made-up past adventure, and it just becomes something that the brain symbolically represents as a, camping or each one of these things, and they just become those categories that all of this data ends up being put in eventually. So I'm just saying this is it's pretty much understandable. Obviously the feeling thing is going to be the tricky one. Feelings are so strange and they're so emotionally different that, yeah, obviously I would have to give some sort of explaining this, how exactly it creates the feeling, how this arrow does its job, is a lot more complicated than explaining this thinking one, I guess I would argue. But let's just say for the purpose of this argument that this mechanism has been created, quite obviously. And the key thing to it is that without this mechanism, you probably couldn't learn, right? You couldn't improve, because this capacity to assign value through a positive and negative sensation, through repulsion and attraction, this is what makes learning possible, which makes this improving of your reactions possible, which makes improving your thinking possible. So all of this can't get filtered. It can't become improved. It can't become a better will, or a better human, or a better anything, unless this is fully engaged. You've got to have this work in terms of becoming more efficient and being more well, efficient's a great word. I mean, I like it. So yeah, you become more efficient in your interactions and in your throwing of strikes and of living a life through this rewarding stuff that meets the standards of the memory of the categories that are established. So our brain does establish categories of what success looks like and what failure looks like, based on, clearly more categories. So you learn what a strike looks like first, and then you learn how to throw one. And so first your brain establishes a goal, or it hears or sees somebody else do it right, and it says, that's what doing it right looks like, I'm going to try to do it right. And so anyway, but it's all just these words, right? I mean, there's just important words. You got input, output, you got reflex, yeah, feedback. So input, output, reflexes, just knee jerks, but a lot of them inside the CPU, just on-offs, yes, no's, and feedback, reward, punishment, some other word for that probably. But yeah, it's just not. So there's nothing in this. There's nothing in this model of consciousness not being the CPU, consciousness not having any squigglies in it at all. It doesn't have any reflexes in it. It doesn't have anything in it. It's just the place where this sixth sense is created, where the brain creates sense input, and it just becomes another sense. So the sense of consciousness, a sense of consciousness, there, would be a perfectly good way to describe what's happening. And so I don't think I don't think I have to do any more thinking. I think consciousness creates the sense creates thoughts and feelings that are created in that sense organ. illusionary or not. And because the point is, the CPU certainly doesn't think it's illusionary. But anyway, so I think that's enough. But I mean, the consciousness is just a byproduct, technically, you could argue, of having to create internal feedback for the brain and creating this positive-negative mechanism. So consciousness isn't necessary per se, because it is just a witness, but it's the only way to manufacture a new sense, an internal sense, essentially, and especially a sense that has a true positive and negative nature, a reward and punishment capacity, a whip and a carrot mechanism. Okay, yeah, I think that's really enough. So, thank you very much. Till next time, we'll draw something better eventually. But, you know, got a lot of things to do. Yeah, like a lot of them. Should do it in crayon, it'd be prettier.